Today marks the 15th anniversary of the Book Review podcast, so happy birthday to us. And to help celebrate, I've called in a few friends. First up, former editor of the Book Review, former host of the Book Review podcast, my former boss, and still my friend, Sam Tanenahus, joins us together with the podcast's co-founder, Dwight Garner, now a book critic for the New York Times. After that, our very own producer extraordinaire, Pedro Rosado, and our amazing alumni producer, Jocelyn Gonzales, will join us to talk about how the sausage gets made. Alexandra Alter will have an update from the publishing world. And finally, podcast co-conspirator John Williams will be here to grill me about the last 10 years of hosting this thing. This is the Book Review podcast from the New York Times. It's April 16th. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now, the former host of the podcast and author of Whitaker Chambers, a biography, and The Death of Conservatism, as well as a forthcoming biography of William F. Buckley, Sam Tanenahus, and Dwight Garner, critic at the New York Times and former senior editor at the Book Review. Hi there.
Hello.
Let's talk about the dawn of the podcast, because both of you were responsible, but whose idea specifically was this?
Dwight's. I remember very well. It was your idea.
Well, this was back in a period, right, where, they were kind of new podcasts to some degree, and even it was kind of the blog period. What year was this, Sam?
Pamela, was it 2006?
It was, yes. This is the 15th anniversary, so unless you all plotted for a year, it was 2006.
And our first guest was Gary Steingart, correct?
Right. So I get to repeat the story I always tell about that. We'll just assume that listeners haven't heard this like 3 million times, which is that Dwight sent a note to Gary Steingart. And what was the novel, Dwight? Was it Absurdistan?
I think it was.
And Dwight sent a note to Steingart, who was a prominent novelist then, but not like a household name the way he is now. And Dwight sent him a note and he said, "Would you like to do a podcast?" And he replied, I remember this verbatim, "Yes, or at least find out what one is." Because nobody really knew. Dwight knew because he was up in all the tech stuff.
Yeah, did you know, Sam? Because Dwight, you started all these things. You had the blog and you had a music playlist that you had for authors. But Sam, did you know what he was talking about when he said, "I want to have a podcast"?
No, are you kidding? I was looking forward to the hot new history book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, because I was still convinced it was going strong. No, I'd never heard of it. Dwight said, in fact, the first idea I think Dwight mentioned was that we have these 30-minute readings, and he wanted to get like an NPR host. Do you remember that, Dwight?
God, you're bringing back some scary memories.
Yeah, it's the only hubristic thing, in my view, that I ever did at the Book Review was I kind of slept on that for a couple of nights and came in and very timidly said, "I think I should be the interviewer and the host." First of all, we could not afford somebody from NPR to start with.
And what was that like for you, hosting, having not done one of these before?
I had no idea what I was doing. I wrote these really stupid jokes to open the segment. John Williams, who was putting together some stuff on this, and I know is still at the Times and writes and does all sorts of stuff, told me that he was listening to some of the early ones, and I would make these really cornball introductions, and then finally people told me, "Stop," And so I didn't do that anymore. We just started interviewing, but we didn't know how to do it. Because you'll remember, Dwight, at that point, we had no idea that we could actually get authors on. So we would interview one another. It was very much a garage band kind of thing. And like those two guys in Saturday Night Live who were making commercials again, Mike Myers and the other one, Dana Carvey. That's sort of what it was like. And so we didn't know that you could go to a publisher and ask them if an author might be available, because nobody was doing this stuff. And then how long did it take, Dwight, before Mick Sussman, who sort of ran it at that point, and now is like the Mr. Spock of the homepage at the Times, but he was the one who started hearing, he was our first producer, and he started hearing from publishers who asked if they could put authors on, because we had no idea, unless it was a friend of Dwight's like Gary Steingart, that we could regularly bring authors in.
It was fun to bring them up and have them sign the wall. We had a wall in a little booth-like area at the paper, and writers all signed their names on the wall. And it became a kind of a thing.
It's still there.
Really? It's been preserved?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's in one of the privacy chambers at the Times. And yeah, it still exists.
Awesome.
Right. I have two regrets about that because I remember someone was writing a little story about it for the paper about the wall, which was another one of Dwight's great ideas, is the two people I forgot to take into that room to sign it were two of the famous Johns, Irving and Updike. And Updike it wasn't so much that I forgot to take him in, is that was our very first video interview, which I'm sure lives somewhere on the website. And we'd gone upstairs to that, fancy boardroom to do it because it was John Updike. And I just didn't think I could then ask him to take the elevator all the way down to the office and write his name.
All right, you've started dropping names, so I want to ask you about some specific names. You had Toni Morrison on the podcast. What was that like?
Well, she was very impressive and kind of regal, and also, though, was very kind and generous, too. She had a kind of wall of reserve, a moat around her, which is, a lot of these really famous authors have. But I liked interviewing her, and I interviewed her again. She asked me to interview her at the 92nd Street Y. I think we talked about Obama. I went to an apartment and interviewed her, I remember now. Sometimes authors would prefer that rather than coming into the building. The one who came into the building who created a sensation was Patti Smith.
What was that like?
She came into my office, which was this terrible mess, as my offices always are. And she said, "Don't worry about it. It looks just like my apartment at home." But not only that, she said, "This is a really big deal for me because one of her first jobs in New York was working at Brentano's, the old bookstore."
Oh, yeah.
If anybody remembers that term, bookstore, it was kind of like a physical place where you went in and bought books that had like these hard covers. And when she worked at Brentano's, they made the staff read the book review every week so they would be properly educated.
I think every place in America, every employer should make their staff read the book review every week.
Yeah, starting with you, Pamela. Well, and then, here's the thing, though. Then we went into the newsroom. That's what I would do when guests came in, if they were kind of names like that. And they're curious or fascinated by the Times. It's a famous institution. They'd want to see it. Andre Agassi was another big star we took through. Well, when Patti Smith and I went down, a floor or two, we were then on the 5th floor, I think, in the newsrooms. We're 4 and 3, connected by the staircase. People now, I'm an English major, so I mean this when I say it. People literally climbed over their cubicles to see her. We mean like famous reporters and editors were crawling over to see Patti Smith, and they'd say, "I heard you at Roseland in 1976, stuff like that." So they were really dazzled by her. She would not do a video interview because she was self-conscious about, her appearance, but she was great. Andre Agassi was great. And the biggest of all, Pedro will remember this. If you're producing this, right, Pedro?
I am indeed.
You remember who it was, right? He called you Pete.
Only other person on the planet except my mom that can call me Pete.
And tell everybody who it was.
Keith Richards.
Keith Richards. And that we did on the phone.
Ah, was that disappointing?
It was. To me, it was amazing that he was so punctual because I know a little bit about Keith Richards. And I thought, well, if we hear him, it's going to be, 10 hours later. But he was at 3:00 sharp where we were supposed to do it. And he was in Connecticut. He has some estate there. And he was great. He was fantastic.
Who were your favorite guests, sort of surprise guests, like people who maybe you didn't think were going to be that interesting or surprising and yet were?
Well, this is kind of a backward way of saying it, but the people normally I had the most trouble with were novelists.
Those people,
because they would say things like, "Well, I really grew closer to Ruth than to Melvin because Ruth spoke more to me in the 4th draft." And I'm thinking, you know what? That's great for me. It's not working for a listener. And the same thing happened when reviewers came in and talked about novels, because the listener doesn't know any of this stuff. So it can't be too detailed. Well, Francine Prose came in once and did the most crystalline, clear, elegant description of a novel. And I was just so impressed by that she made anyone want to read it. And I thought that's a gift. So in that way, it was really surprising. Now, she's a big name, but nevertheless, she came in on the radio program and did it that well. And I was really, really impressed by that. Dwight, you should be speaking up here because this whole thing was really yours and not mine.
No. I'm kind of sitting here thinking about famous disasters, Sam. I remember the two of us once interviewing Calvin Trillin over the phone. I think we were in your office at the old building, at the old New York Times building on 43rd Street. We talked to him for about an hour, then realized the machine hadn't worked.
So we had to do it again.
We had to do it again. And he was such a mensch.
He really was a mensch. Yeah, that's right. Leave it to Dwight to come up with the disasters. But, Dwight's famous for that. Like back at Salon, didn't you do the worst books of the year at Salon?
Well, disasters, fam, they're always more fun than the non-disasters.
They are.
I remember another disaster for me anyway. I'm not going to name the writer, but a very famous writer, a writer whom I actually really admire and love. But a British writer came up to the office, and I'd forgotten that she was coming in that day. And there she was at my desk, ready to be interviewed. I'd forgotten her name. I didn't know who she was. And we had to go tape an interview. So I had to do a Charlie Rose thing, right? I'd lob, your book, why now kind of questions, because not knowing a thing about it. And finally, after about 5 minutes, I realized, yes, it's you. And it was really humiliating because I really like her. And I just had a blank.
Yeah, so easily things like that happen.
So Sam, did Henry Louis Gates and Cornel West come in together for the podcast?
Yes, you're right. We brought them both in. That was really early on because I know what we had done was a kind of anniversary issue on the Brown decision. And we were kind of experimenting with the back page and we did a kind of, I know what it was, right? It was a dialogue, it was a conversation. So I don't think it was necessarily for the podcast. I think we actually taped it somewhere else and then printed the text in the book review. Okay. And it was a conversation with both those guys. And we had to do it in a different studio because there were no, electronics, no recording studios that I was aware of, at least in the old building, as we call it. It sounds so pompous, but it was an old building on 43rd Street. So we had to walk down to, I think, 37th Street to record it. And again, people just came out of doorways to greet these two. At that moment, Cornell was actually the better known of the two. Skip is on, he's doing that great program, that Roots program, which my wife and I watch all the time. They were both really famous, but I think Cornell was just a little bit more famous. He's also very dramatic looking. Skip Gates is not so much.
I remember you talked about charisma and Patti Smith's charisma. I remember the day Cornel West and Henry Louis Gates walked into the book review offices, and I was facing away from them. I was facing, towards a wall, and I literally felt them come into the room. Their force of charisma made me turn around and say, "Somebody's here," and they just radiated, just kind of like crackling charisma and charm.
They really did. And together, there's very interesting pair. They're great friends, obviously, but with a lot of differences in their affect and their attitudes. And yeah, it was very interesting to see, intellectual celebrities or celebrity intellectuals. I'm writing a book about one. They're Bill Buckley. They're a very rare breed, and they were too. I'll tell you somebody else who made a huge impression on me, Pamela, whom I think you may have interviewed, who had a different kind of charisma. That was Henry Kissinger.
Oh, yeah.
And what did you make of it? Did you interview him?
I did. I interviewed him on the phone and we spoke for a very long time. I believe he thought it was the radio, but he was pretty forthcoming. And I was surprised because I had once done a written interview with him that was extremely terse, so terse that I think it was too short to be published, but he spoke at length. What was your experience like?
He is one of the two or maybe three most intelligent people whose presence I've ever felt myself in. And people are really shocked by that, especially if they have, ideological or political problems with Kissinger. And a lot of people do, and I might be one of them. But I felt the force of his intellect. I mean, that again was done in a video. It was a video interview done at his office when I don't know if he still runs at Kissinger Associates, but he did back then. And I just thought this guy is like world historical smart. Somebody else I felt that with, although I don't think we interviewed him, Dwight, maybe you'll remember, is the late Tony Judt, the historian.
I don't recall.
Just the power of his mind when, I met him or, I knew him a little bit. It just worked faster, when you're in the presence of someone whose mind is just operating in a higher plane. I mean, Philip Roth had a little bit of that too, where they're thinking faster. The words come to them more quickly. You're forming your sentence, but you should stop after the second word because they already know what you're going to say and are ready to correct you. It's just a power of intellect that's very striking, and you feel it in this format because you're, batting it back and forth.
Did Roth come on the podcast?
No, I don't think he did, Dwight. No, he never came.
No.
He might have come into the old office once, but I don't think so. I encountered him in different places, but not for that. And I bet you if he'd done it, he would have wanted a scripted interview. That was my least favorite interview, not Philip Roth, because I didn't interview him. But there was another really, really successful author who came in with a script.
What does that mean? They gave you questions to ask?
Yes, and I didn't want to do it, but we felt we had to. I'll tell you who it was. I mean, I'm out of the game now, so it doesn't matter so much. It was Suzanne Collins, the children's book or YA author who wrote those hugely successful novels.
The Hunger Games.
The Hunger Games. The books were really, really big, and your predecessor as children's books editor, Pamela, Julie just brought her in, and she was really excited to have her. She said, this is the biggest writer going in young adult literature, and I'm sure it was true. But, and I got it later, is that she was protecting, not so much protecting a franchise, that was the phrase I was going to use, as performing, she thought, a kind of civic purpose. And so she had to be really careful and guarded in what she was asked and how she answered it. So she had a script, and I think it was actually Julie who asked the questions. I'm not sure now, but they were written out. So you had to ask those questions. And as a journalist, you don't want to do that. So it was, unsettling. I didn't like it.
How did you pick out which guests to have on?
The producer would do it first, Blake Wilson, and then John Williams. They would come in and say, well, you try to get somebody who's got the cover review, the author, if possible. And that was a fun ritual for us, Pamela. I don't know. Well, of course, now you can't do it. But pre-pandemic, it was a fun thing for us because we would do it the morning that when we got the printed copy. And for some of you listeners out there, print is an archaic term that means a different kind of analog for language that appears on a kind of solid, like what they used to call parchment and we called paper. And so when authors came in, they got the print edition that day. We would get it, and they would read the review for the very first time before we did the podcast. And they'd be psyched, because normally if you have your book reviewed on the cover, it's going to be, if not, absolutely 100% favorable, it's still going to be respectful and admiring, and it's a lot of attention for your book. So they would come in and get kind of jazzed up by that. And then we would do the interview. And then we would have, I think, one reviewer come in. And then Dwight would do his great column. Another one of Dwight's innovations was the Inside the Bestseller List column. That was Dwight's idea. And you would do that, right? Dwight, didn't you do a report on that?
And I'm vaguely sympathetic to Suzanne Collins, because for a while there, I was nervous about what I would say, and I would write things down. And you have the gift of gab. Matter of fact, we should talk about your interview style, because I've always admired it. You have a theory about how much research you should do or not do before an author interview.
Well, I think what you said before, Dwight, about interviewing somebody cold and not even knowing who they are and what their book is actually the best way to do it. Pamela, you've done a lot of interviewing now, and haven't you kind of found that if you know too much about the book, you get tangled up in things that leave a listener behind?
Yes. I think there's a space between that, overreading and over preparation, and total absence of preparation where I live most comfortably. But I have found that if I've read something cover to cover and I'm dying to talk about it, then it's really all about me and my own, like, very insular kind of questions, nitty gritty, like, why at the beginning of chapter 3 did you? So I agree that's a risk. But I've admired your preparation, which was what exactly? I'm following up on Dwight.
Let's not talk about my preparation. I mean, there was not a whole lot to it. I mean, I would try to be as familiar as most interviewers are. You know who the author is. Maybe you know generally their work. You're familiar. You have some familiarity with the book and with the review, and just open it up for them. Here's the thing that I would tell this to reporters too when I was, doing other things at the paper and editing the work of, reporters opposed to reviewers. And I would tell them there really is no such thing as a stupid question, because even if the other person, your interlocutor or interviewee, is annoyed by what you've said. And I remember this happened with Martin Amis, and I asked him something and he said, no, that's not what's going on. And then he gave his answer and I thought, okay, I feel stupid, but it's good radio.
Right.
It's good radio. And so that's kind of what you learn to do. And the same thing with a reporter. If you get under somebody's skin or you've got something wrong and they correct you, that's really helpful. And you just have to get used to that. So I thought, it's okay if I don't really know. Also, this too, Pamela, is because we had this, this pretty big job, authors kind of cut you some slack. They know you've got a lot of books in each issue, that you're responsible to other people. They're somewhat respectful toward the position one has as the editor. So they're just glad to be there and they make it easier that way.
What do you miss about hosting the podcast?
The moment right before and right after the interview. The thing I'm proudest of, here I am so applauding myself, was when we did the very last one and I asked our producer at that time, Jocelyn, to say something. And she said, well, we had done something like 1,200 interviews. And she said she'd never seen or heard a guest feel uncomfortable when we did it. And I was really pleased about that, because that was just making people feel relaxed. And that we would, we'd call it the green room, and we'd have people come in and out just to kind of make people feel more comfortable. And so I liked that moment. I liked that interaction, that exchange with people. Having authors who were nervous about speaking feel better afterwards. That's what I really, really liked. So I miss it.
I think our listeners miss you too. And so before we go, tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
I am in the last phase of getting into shape this gigantic manuscript I have, which is The Life and Times of William F. Buckley, which I am calling, a publisher may decide they don't want it, I'm calling it Conservative Colossus, William F. Buckley Jr. and the World He Made. And it really does try to tell that very big story. And so I hope to finish it in the next couple of months, and we'll see what the publisher does with it. I've sent them a lot of material, but I've got more to do. So it's an interesting time to be writing about a figure like that.
And are you reading anything good?
Yes. My wife, Kathy, and I read at night. We read aloud. I do the reading, and we just prefer it that way. So we're alternating 2 books. I had never read Never Let Me Go by Ishiguro, which our daughter liked. So we're reading that. And we're also, for me, for the umpteenth time, reading or rereading Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station, which is a fantastic book. It's sort of a model for me, that aspirational model you can never achieve, right, Dwight? You know about those? Mm-hmm. Those books that, when you're if you were some other person, you would be able to write them. So those are the two books we're reading. I tend to read older stuff and I have trouble keeping up with the new things.
All right, Dwight, I'm going to leave you to ask the final question.
So, Sam, you're looking forward to coming back to the podcast to talk about the Buckley book?
Well, if you all decide you want me, sure. It's really hard to talk about. It's just so big. You know, I've been working on it for a really long time, and he was a very interesting, complicated guy. I don't want to do a ton of stuff, though. Here's an idea I'm going to throw out to the two of you, and then we can end with this. I am on this sort of campaign, a personal campaign, to see if I can get the publisher not to have anybody write what they call an endorsement and everybody else calls a blurb. I just don't find them convincing. If you saw that Fran Lebowitz program where Scorsese interviews her, my favorite thing is when she said she called up some author and said, "How could you write that blurb in that lousy book?" And the author said, "Well, it's a friend of mine." And she said, "Well, great. That's not doing your readers any good, you know?" So that's one way of saying I do hope not to do a whole lot of, I don't know, extracurricular presentation and just get the book out there. But I'll be happy to revisit the podcast.
Well, I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I was going to say, Sam.
Easy to say.
Sam, you're going to become one of those reluctant guests who's difficult to draw out and get them to talk about the material. I look forward to prying it out of you.
I'll give you a list of questions like Suzanne
That's
Collins.
right. All right, Sam, it is such a pleasure to have you back on here. And Dwight, great talking to you always.
This was fun.
Great talking to you both.
To help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review, Tina Jordan. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different and fun, I think. I recently wondered what the very first mentions of famous authors were in the Times and the Book Review. And so armed with our digital archive and actually a professional service called ProQuest, I started delving back to see what the very first mentions of famous authors were. And I'm going to give you just a few. One of my favorites is Agatha Christie, who shows up for the first time in a gossip column. I think I've said this before, Pamela. I really wish we could revive the gossip column in the Book Review. This one was called Books and Authors. And the Book Review reported, an interesting story is told about how The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie, a detective novel announced for fall publication, came to be written. The author had never before attempted to write a book, but made a wager that she could write a detective story in which the reader would not be able to pick out the murderer. She was at least successful enough to have her work chosen as a book. So that's how Agatha Christie came to write all those dozens of books.
Wow.
It was the result of a bet. Another one of my favorites is the novelist Edna Ferber, who had just written a first novel called Dawn O'Hara, which was not reviewed. And she too appeared in the Book Review's gossip column on April 29th, 1911. The paper said, she commenced on her journalistic career at 17 on a paper working as a reporter. She has since declared to us that a year of foreign travel and a whole course in college couldn't have crammed half so much in my head as did the 18 months of small-town journalism. And probably my favorite is F. Scott Fitzgerald.
If he's not in the gossip column, then I don't understand this gossip column.
It's even better. So he was in the photo section in 1916. The paper had, a beautiful fold-out photo section every week. And he was at Princeton at the time, and he had written a play with Edmund Wilson called The Evil Eye, in which he played a woman in character. And I think it's worth reminding people that Princeton, of course, was all male at this time. So men always played women's roles in plays. It was not uncommon.
We were not making fun of F. Scott Fitzgerald in any way.
We weren't making fun. This was a serious mention of the play and serious notice of him as an actor. It simply got a picture of him dressed as a woman, looking beautiful, and identifying him, as the author of this play. And I actually had to do a double take at first. It's definitely him, dressed as a woman. And as far as I can tell, although it was a Princeton Triangle Club play, the play did travel and I think did come to New York. So there you have it.
So F. Scott Fitzgerald first appeared in the New York Times as a woman.
That's right.
All right, then. Tina, thank you so much.
See you next week.
Joining us now, Jocelyn Gonzales, the director of PRX Productions, and Pedro Rosado, the founder of Headstepper Media, both otherwise known as the former producer of the Book Review podcast and the current producer of the Book Review podcast. Jocelyn, Pedro, thanks for being here.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
So I want to go over some of the backstory and history of the Book Review podcast with both of you. But let's start with each of your history at the Times. Jocelyn, how did you end up at the Times? And then Pedro, I want to hear from you too.
I was just leaving, I think, a culture reporting position at WNYC and was looking for other work. And then I heard that WQXR was actually looking for a producer to help with the podcast coming out of the Times. And that's really where I met Sam and Pedro and JD, actually, because they were doing a technology show. And they needed someone to devote more time to it and really format the shows into something that sounded more professional. So that's basically when I started. I started on the Book Review and Tech Talk and eventually took on Popcast and a little bit of Science Times.
And when was this?
Oh, man.
This is a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. These podcasts were running for several years, I think, before I came along as sort of ad hoc, very casual. I think they were just recording in Sam Tanenahus' office with like a portable recorder. That might have been like maybe 2008 or something like that.
Yes, I think that sounds right. This is back when the New York Times owned the radio station QXR.
Yep, as a classical music station.
And so the podcasts aired on QXR alongside the classical music?
Yeah, actually, the Book Review podcast was 15 minutes long.
Yeah, they had a 15-minute slot every Friday.
Yep, and we would finish the show, and we had to shoehorn all of these author interviews into 15 minutes. So literally, the author interviews were maybe 5 minutes, three to 5 minutes. Plus, we were still looking at the list every week, and we had news from the publishing world. So we jam-packed it all into 15 minutes. I would send the file to the desk, and then I would make a CD and walk it over to the radio station and hand it off to the DJ. Sneakernet, we called it.
Oh, wow. So like, did you have the ability to really even edit it?
It was a pretty brutal edit. Jane Bornmeyer was our audio executive editor at the time. And sometimes we would sit there and listen over and over again, like, what is one breath or half a phrase that we can cut out to get it to that broadcast 15 minutes? I still think it was a really good show. I'm amazed like what we did with that little time.
It wasn't always 15 minutes though, right? I mean, it started out longer, and then when it went on to QXR, it shortened down to 15 minutes, and then it got longer again when that ended.
Yeah, it started off as a podcast first, I believe in 2006. I think it was the first one.
Yes.
Either 2005 or 2006. And it was, a free-form podcast. It could go as long as we liked. And when the deal was struck with WQXR, that's when they decided to give it a 15-minute break. And that was when Jocelyn's hell began.
So, Pedro, were you there at the very beginning? Did you work at the Times in 2006?
I started at the New York Times in 1995. I was one of the very last copy boys or copy persons, copy people. And
what is a copy boy?
Oh, yeah. My God. If you see any of those old movies where the frazzled reporter screams, "Copy!" and some young kid runs over, picks it up and takes it to the composing room. That was supposed to be me. But by then we actually had computers when we started. So most of it was running around and getting people sandwiches and stuff like that.
Really? And so did your title actually say copy boy?
I was a copy person at that point.
Okay.
They were a little more civilized and evolved by then. And I sat in a bank of chairs where, and mind you, I was the oldest copy person there because even though I was 29, everyone else were like just out of college. And I had already had a career before that in the music business and in the technology world. Basically, we sat in a bank of chairs and a buzzer went off over our heads. And if it was your buzzer, you ran to the desk that called you and you ran copy downstairs or you got something for whoever it was.
I am just trying to imagine a world with buzzers over our heads at work now. Was that
literally? It was in the old New York Times building where the Discovery Center in Times Square is now. And It was an ancient labyrinth of piled up desks, and it was an experience, to say the least. You had to scurry around and jump over piles of paper, and every one of those movies you see where there's a nightmare newsroom scenario, that was pretty much it.
I see. I tend to glamorize it, and I think of it as like the Hudsucker proxy, with people like swinging.
No. I wish. I only wish.
And so how did you get involved in podcasting at the Times? How does one go from being a copy person to a podcast producer?
Well, it didn't happen right away. I mean, I jumped around from desk to desk. I was an editor for a while on what they call the satellite edition or the national editions. Then I spent some time on the tech desk in the news technology. Then I did some photo work. I mean, really bounced around. Then in 2008, they had expanded the audio department. They created the first audio department, podcast, and they knew I had experience with audio because I was a music producer for a while and a recording engineer. And I am fascinated by doing all sorts of different things. That was a nice thing about being at the Times, although technically I'm still there. I'm sort of semi-retired, but the nice thing about being at the Times was that I was able to pick and choose what areas I wanted to focus on. So when this opportunity came up, I took it, and I've been doing it ever since. I had a brief sojourn over in video for a while.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
Then I came back to the audio department.
And what podcasts have you worked on at the Times?
Every single one.
Yeah, many of them are no longer here, but what were they?
No. Science, Tech Talk with J.D. Bierstofer, who's an editor at the Book Review.
Yep.
And gosh, what else? Oh, we had everyone thinks that the Daily was the first daily news podcast, but there was one that we did with James Barron, a Metro reporter. I forgot the name of it, but it was a daily news podcast out of the newsroom. He did it every day at around 5:00, and we would throw it together in as quickly as possible and post it up. And that also was broadcast on WQXR.
Oh my God, the original daily.
Was it really?
Yeah, the original daily.
On the radio?
Yes, it was also on the radio. And I actually worked on the Daily as well. I was one of the first producers there. I built their studio before everything got started. I helped Michael Barbaro become the personality he is today. So I try to credit myself as often as I can. Oh, there were so many. I think we had a national news show. Do you remember any more, Jocelyn?
Jane Bornemeyer was doing a politics show.
Yes.
I backed up a business show. And I'd say whenever I worked on that, I had no clue what they were talking about, just sort of went along. And then the Times Center would have these special events, and we would pull the audio from those video recordings, and those also went out on their own podcast feed.
So it sounds like the Times went pretty all in on podcasting in its early days.
They really did. Oh my gosh, they really did. But the problem was that, and I don't mean to speak out of school here, but a lot of people in the upper echelons of the newspaper at the time didn't necessarily understand podcasting and what it could bring to the news organization. And it was difficult getting resources and really getting folks at that time. I'm talking about in 2005. Now, I realize in computer world, in 2005, we were still using iPods. There were no iPhones. There wasn't anything like that. So convincing some of these news executives that this was worth diving into was very difficult. And once they did, though, they sort of embraced it until they didn't. That's
then there was the great
different
pruning of podcasts.
Yes, the great pruning.
And we ended up with just the book review and Popcast, right?
Yes, the book review and Popcast. And that happened at around 2011, I believe. And the interesting thing about that was it was you, Pamela, who actually made it happen because you decided.
I killed everything? Wait, what?
No. On the opposite, you kept it alive.
You saved it.
Because once you decided that the book review podcast would continue, it was up to me to make a mad scramble and call in a lot of favors to make sure we actually had space to record this, because you know that space is at a premium at the Times.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't mean to give away the secrets here, but we recorded in some really iffy spaces with construction going on in the background and all that
It's like
stuff.
a traveling roadshow of podcasts.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, basically, I was calling in favors and cutting backroom deals, just trying to keep these things going. And Popcast decided to keep going too.
So tell me your memories of early days on the Book Review podcast with Sam Tanenahus, our original host.
I know I enjoyed coming in early to see whatever was bugging Sam, because he would go on a mini rant and get it out of his system. And then the guests would show up and he was perfectly the most amazing, genial host. So I always liked that. We had a lot of first-time authors who didn't really have a lot of media experience, and being on a podcast was nervous making because it wasn't television. Like, they couldn't quite understand like what this was for. But I always enjoyed how he kind of calmed them down and like coaxed them into talking about their books, and they would always leave relieved that they were taken care of, which I also kind of enjoyed. I do remember Jenny Schuessler and Sam doing their notes from the field thing at the end of the show, because Jenny would come in because she's so organized, right? And tell and coach Sam about what he was going to say, where they were going to banter, and what jokes he should tell.
Oh, wow.
And I would just sit there and I would just record as like, she's got this down, and it would turn up at exactly the length that we needed it to be.
Oh my
like,
God.
exactly.
I want someone to give me jokes. Pedro, will you give me jokes?
I'll try my best.
Jenny Schuessler is, of course, a reporter now in the culture department at the Times, but back then she was an editor at the Book Review and wrote the bestseller column. How did you all figure out the segments of the podcast and how long they would each run? Was some of that on you both, or was that up to Sam? How did that all work out?
The 15-minute radio show would determine what we could do a lot of the time. So that was one thing. But I think when that limitation was lifted, we just started really paying attention to the interviews and the flow of what the conversation was like, to see how long they should be and how many human, funny, or revealing moments there might be in those conversations. And then we'd make the other ones shorter. The back of the book, looking at the list, it is the servicey element of the show, seeing what's on the list, but it's also performs this function of connecting the list, reading books, authors to the wider current affairs landscape. So to me, that was like a valuable thing that we should always keep at several minutes, so we had a chance to connect what people are reading to the wider culture and what was happening in the news landscape.
And the nice thing about the podcast world is that you can let an interview breathe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've been a lot of interviews, Pamela, that you've done that, because you're getting a particularly emotional response out of the person, I'll leave those long pauses, those long breaths in there when the person is trying to collect themselves, or even when you're trying to collect yourself. Because that's the nice thing about your technique, is that you don't mind getting emotional on the microphone. That's interesting for a listener, and it also makes you connect more, or the host connect more with the audience. And I think you've seen that too. I mean, the feedback from people listening is they're connecting with you as their proxy to these authors and to the editors on the book review. And that's fun for me. And you can't do that on a radio show.
Yeah.
You have a very limited amount of time. And that's the nice thing about doing the podcast the way we do it.
We have time to emote.
Exactly.
Can I add just one thing to that too? In this like latter incarnation of the show, the editors getting around the table at the end of the show now has been really interesting, because I think that people look at the book review, it's so legendary. It's people admire it from afar. Everyone wants to be in it, and then they hate it at the same time. Like to see what the editors are reading, what their thought process is. My favorite period was that whole time when, Pamela, you were reading the Hamilton biography, and like every week was like, Pamela's on chapter 15. Read faster. What was nice about that is that's very much the experience that a lot of people have reading and trying to get through things, and knowing that the almighty editors of the book review, so influential, go through the same things that we do as readers, as I think is like really fun every week to hear about that.
Greg's Ulysses. Which authors were you each most excited to have come into the studio to get to meet or listen to?
I was really excited when Colson Whitehead came by, just because I'd just never been in the same room. And I was very quiet, kind of starstruck. I liked seeing Phil Clay come in right after his first book came in. Jack Vertel.
Oh, yeah.
Jack Vertel, Broadway historian, knows everything about musicals. That was 100% fun. And learning all the terms for musical theater was really interesting, even in the short time that we had. There's weird ones that I remember too. Like, I don't even remember what author this was, but did someone do a tape sync with us, like in a submarine or something? Or and then
I don't know, but I hope so. That sounds fascinating.
There was a British author who called into the show to talk to Pamela, but she said, "I'm sorry, I'm crouching between two parked cars in the street. I hope it's not too noisy," is what she told me before I clicked her through.
Oh my God, I don't remember that. Do you remember there was a British writer who came on, and at a certain point, it was clear that he wasn't certain of the technology that we were using. But at some point, he casually referred to us being on the wireless. Do you remember that?
Oh, no. That's us. We're wireless.
My two favorite interviews, actually, I have three. One with Sam and two with you, Pamela. It was the Sam one was Keith Richards. And he, obviously, I have it with my musical background. He was great.
Wait, was Keith in studio?
No, unfortunately, he was on the phone. But Patti Smith came in, and that was a whole different story. But Keith Richards insisted on calling me Pete. And I really am not a Pete kind of person. But he's the only person on the planet that can call me Pete. My all-time favorite was Robert Caro. That was just an amazing interview. Just meeting him and just the whole interview itself, my favorite. And then Stephen Fry. That was that was in our current incarnate, but that was such a great interview. That was just so much fun, and he was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
He was so great. He was so great.
Oh, yeah.
I do have these. I have these memory associations with different recordings. So I remember Colson coming in. I think Jocelyn, that was for Underground Railroad, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was a kind of funny year because I interviewed Colson, I think 4 times that year. And so, one of which was in Sydney. So it's just like we meet again every time we saw each other. But the podcast one was the first one. So I have these kind of visceral memories of which studio we were in because we traveled around so much, and if the person was in the studio or if it was by phone. But now I have all these closet memories, right? So I'm in the closet and I'm like, I remember Stephen Fry, and I'm like, the shoes were over there,
Oh, I don't mean to laugh, but that's hilarious.
That live show on the 15th floor that we did with Sam and Gary Steingart, I think it was the 10th anniversary of the podcast. That was great. I love seeing the audience reaction to the show and seeing some of the listeners who've been listening to it all along. And also Gary was hilarious.
He was so good.
He really lifted something that could have been just like kind of us patting ourselves on the back. So he was like a good presence there.
All right. Here's a funny and awkward question, and you can answer it or not. And I can't judge this myself, but what changed between having Sam host it and having me host it?
Hold on a second. I'll take this one. The difference is Sam walked in, and this is no slight on Sam. Sam walked into the studio with a copy of the book review and nothing else. And he would just launch into it. I honestly don't know. I mean, he may have done hours of preparation beforehand, but God bless him. When he walked in there, I would get terrified. Pamela, when you walk in, I breathe a sigh of relief. You got a stack of books with you. You got a sheaf of paper. That is the kind of hosting that makes me comfortable. I know I'm in good hands at that point.
Yeah, I think I track with that. Sam definitely was like throw authors in at the deep end immediately.
Yeah.
And then see if we can, how quickly can we slice and dice and exchange ideas, right? Let's get to the meat fast now. Why? With Pamela, with you as host, it is probably a little less intimidating for the authors, but it is a warmer show. It's welcoming to the authors, yes, but also definitely a show that thinks about the listener and the reader who is with us on the journey. And that's sort of what it feels like, a journey in sound through the book review every week. Because it feels like when I was a kid and I would read the book review and not understand half of the reviews and know that I'll never be grown enough to read some of these books. Like I would read it thinking that just touching it or trying to get through one of the reviews would make me smarter. And I had like the same feeling coming to the book review with both hosts, that I'm going to be smarter just by proximity. And I'll be smarter in different ways with Sam as host and then with you, Pamela, as host. So like my experience across both iterations has been like really full.
I have to say that here we are in complete alignment, not in that I make myself feel smarter, because I most certainly don't, but I feel like both of you have made me sound smarter than I am, which is very helpful.
That's more important.
That's right. That's right.
Before we go, Jocelyn, since you have abandoned us at the Times, tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
When I left the Times, I went to go become executive producer of Studio 360, which was the National Arts and Culture radio show that was hosted by Kurt Anderson. And we closed down that show just before things locked down last year, after 20 years on the air and in doing podcasts. And then I went on to a new position at PRX, which is a company that has a large portfolio of radio shows and podcasts, some of which you may heard of. And I basically sit in a boutique production studio where we help develop, launch, and produce podcasts with different collaborators and partners. So we work with TED, we work with Nova, we work with CBS News. So we have like a number of partners that we create shows with.
Got it. And Pedro, this isn't your only gig. You do other things. What else do you produce besides the book review podcast?
I still do the podcast. I mean, I have a strange arrangement with the New York Times. Well, thankfully I still do, but I have a small media company. We focus on podcasts specifically for small news organizations, or pretty much any organization that wants to produce podcasts, but don't have the technical knowledge or the equipment or the space. Headstepper Media will help these small companies, mostly minority owned. We focus on minority owned businesses, but I do some stuff for other news organizations. I have done stuff for PRX, for Jocelyn, actually, and for a lot of other organizations out there. It's been fun. I did my 25 years at the Times, and now I get to do fun stuff on my own, but I still have my New York Times family to fall back on.
You've done your time, but you still talk to us.
I still do. Yes, I do.
All right. Well, I could not podcast without you. So Pedro Rosado and Jocelyn Gonzales, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with the good, the bad, and the ugly about the pandemic and publishing. Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. So yes, there is good, bad, ugly. Again, there continues to be really strong interest in books from consumers, and the surge in book sales in all formats has been a real silver lining for the industry as it's wrestled with the economic and health crisis and the shutdown. And of course, that has been hard on a lot of sectors of the industry, particularly physical bookstores. But unit sales of print books rose almost 30% in the first quarter of this year in 2021. That is continuing a really strong 2020. So I think what publishers are wondering is, are these new readers, are these people who are home who are just reading more, and how can we hold on to them? You saw a big jump in adult fiction, which increased more than 34%, according to BookScan. And graphic novels were massively up, more than 146%.
Wow. What was there was a new Dogman. What else?
Dogman continues to be a huge hit with all children, including my own. The rate at which they are published and consumed is astonishing, as well as Jeff Kinney. He keeps expanding his universe, his Wimpy Kids series, and he's gotten kind of a spin-off series going. So now he has several releases a year. There were also big jumps in fantasy novels, which were up 48%, according to BookScan. Science fiction up 40%. So, in romance up almost 30%. So escapist fare is
I was going to say
popular.
escaping reality in every possible way.
Exactly. Give it to me. Put it in my veins, as they say. So we're seeing incredible interest in those kinds of books. There was a very popular release in the poetry category. Amanda Gorman, who made a big splash at the presidential inauguration with her inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb, released that as a book, and it sold more than 200,000 copies in its first week, which is, for poetry, a mega blockbuster, obviously.
Right. Debuted at #1 on our bestseller list.
Yes. So that's been an exciting development in poetry sales. And then, I promised you bad news because I know you expect that of me. Unfortunately, there is still a real concern about the health of physical bookstores, which have really struggled during the pandemic and shut down. Their sales dropped by nearly 30% in 2020, and in 2021, sales are also down in that sector. We saw new numbers from the Census Bureau that showed sales were down nearly 20% in the first 2 months of 2021 compared to the previous year. And that is in a retail environment where in other sectors, sales are up. February sales rose almost 3% for the entire retail sector. So there are still real challenges for physical bookstores. And I think there's a little bit of fear that whatever habits people are developing around how they buy books could carry over post-pandemic. So I know that some publishers like Penguin Random House are trying to support independent stores. They're giving them more time to pay their bills and things like that. And I think we'll see probably a lot of people in the industry kind of rallying around that piece of the ecosystem.
I'm hoping that counts for the ugly as well.
Yes, that's going to be the ugly in conclusion.
All right, Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is John Williams, and I'm here to turn the tables on our host, Pamela Paul, and ask her some questions on the occasion of the podcast's 15th anniversary. Hi, Pamela.
Hey, John.
So, what's funny is that you are now the longest running host of the podcast, which I'm sure you're aware of. If this month marks 15 years of the podcast as a whole, it also marks the 8th anniversary of your taking the reins. How does that feel?
I still feel like an usurper. I remember the first week that I hosted, really happened by accident because Sam, as you may recall, he left the position of the editorship of the book review, but he didn't leave the Times, and he didn't leave his office for quite some time. So there was this really kind of nebulous interregnum where one day, I remember he said, "Come on and join the last podcast." And I don't think my job had even been announced yet. So I had a vague sense that that was something was awry. Because I then realized, well, if it's your last podcast, who's hosting next week? And he, of course, said, "You are," which was terrifying. I hadn't fully grappled with the fact at that point that I was going to be editing the book review, let alone hosting the podcast. So I actually hosted the podcast before I was even the editor.
Wow. Yeah. When I looked back, I saw that the announcement of you getting the job publicly and the first podcast was within, I think, 7 or 8 days of each other, which seems a little nuts.
Yeah. Which came first? I don't know.
And I think in that first episode, you talked to Meg Wolitzer about her novel, The Interstings. Do you have any memory of kind of going into that episode? And were you actually nervous, or did it just seem like a blur?
I did a little cheat there, I guess. I didn't even recall that. But Meg is a friend. So, I probably intentionally chose someone who wouldn't terrify me. She's an easy interview, too.
She's a great interview. Yeah, you eased yourself into the job.
That's right. But I do think Harry Evans was shortly after that, Sir Harold Evans, the late Sir Harold Evans. And I also knew, but I found him incredibly intimidating because who wouldn't be? I mean, once you get to know him, he was an absolute delight and totally charming and put you at ease. But just the idea of him, and just the sir, anyone who has a sir before their name, how can you not be a little bit afraid?
Do you remember when you got more comfortable with the job? How long did it take you to feel settled in? And because I know you enjoy the podcast a lot now.
Yeah, it only took 7 years. Wow, I'm trying to think. there were some changes that we introduced that I made it more of a pleasure. I really enjoyed when we started to have the conversations around what we're reading and to bring in more people from around the desk into the podcast. Then I really felt like, okay, this is just a conversation with the people I work with. But there was another point that marked a change for me, and I can't quite situate it in time, but it was more of a mental shift in which I realized that two things about the author interviews. One was that, in fact, what I was able to do through these interviews was to retain a component of reporting that I used to do when I was a freelance writer. And so having it exercise that muscle, which otherwise, would have atrophied during this long editorship, was really rewarding. And once I kind of realized that's what I was actually doing, then I started to really revel in it. And then the other part that marked a shift for me was when I realized at some point that actually these were just conversations and that I could not worry so much maybe necessarily about what our listeners wanted to hear, but really focus on what I wanted to know. And that sounds very selfish and insular, but I started to think, well, if it's genuinely coming from a place of curiosity, then hopefully that'll bring listeners along. So it just was a shift in mindset. And I don't think that happened right away. I think it took a couple of years before I made those two mental shifts.
I saw your list of your favorite 15 episodes from throughout your hosting career that's up online, and people can go find that. And I think the first one you listed, they're not in any particular order, I don't think, but Robert Caro does happen to be at the top. And I'm not sure that that's a coincidence because I know you're a big admirer of his work. Does that stand out among the interviews you've done in terms of having someone in the room where you could probably talk to him for 8 or 9 hours?
Yeah. There are a few podcasts where I've taken up the full hour with an interview. Bob is one. Isabel Wilkerson, the first time I interviewed her when she had reviewed Michelle Obama's memoir, but also talked about The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a book I really admire. That was another one. Having David Sedaris in is always like, okay, let's just hang out for the full hour opportunity. But with Bob, I think everyone who either is from New York or becomes a New Yorker, Bob Caro is part of New York, even just through The Power Broker alone. And I remember after college, I lived in Thailand. And when I moved back from Thailand and I was living in New York, I had intended to move to Hong Kong. But when I decided to stay in New York, I kind of thought, well, let me approach my town as if I were new to it, as if I were moving to Hong Kong and really try to understand it. And so the first book that I read when I came back from living in Asia was The Power Broker. And so to me, that kind of marked my period of being a New Yorker as an adult, as opposed to just being someone from around here. And so Bob Caro, for me, was his writing felt like it was part of who I am and how I became a journalist. The other part of Bob Caro that makes me feel this personal attachment, it's kind of embarrassing, but when I was in high school, I joined the history book club. Do you remember? It was like Columbia House Records. That was like what normal teenagers did. But I joined the history book club, which was like, I think, a sub branch of Book of the Month. And it was a very exciting book club to join if you were that kind of dork, because you'd get like 9 books in your first installment and it was like a penny. And then after that, of course, you were sucked in. It was a continuity program.
You're still paying them.
Yeah, exactly. I was still paying off my debts. But in that first installment, I remember I had a book called Food and History. Like I remember that first installment well. And in that first installment was Path to Power, which was the first volume in what will be presumably 5 volumes of his Lyndon Johnson biography. And I just felt like, such a grown-up reading that book.
Well, and sitting across from him talking must have felt even more like a grown-up.
Yeah.
Like,
I finally grew up at that moment. I was like, I am an adult. I had finally read Master of the Senate shortly before his most recent book was published, which was the short volume Working. And again, it's kind of that, like, I have Marshall McLuhan right here moment where you're like, and here right before you is the author, Leo Tolstoy, ready to answer your questions about Anna Karenina. Like, it felt like, again, go back to my previous answer, like, here's my chance to ask all the questions that I really wanted to know.
Okay, let's listen to a clip of that interview with Caro where the two of you were talking about, appropriately enough, the art of interviewing.
If you looked in my notebooks where I take notes on interviews, you'd find the letters SU written very big sometimes. They mean shut up. It's because I tend to talk too much. And the thing is, if you're interviewing somebody, silence can be a real weapon for you because seems to be a human need to fill a silence. So if you ask a question, if there's a silence, he's not answering it. If you can just shut up long enough, an amazingly large percentage of that time, he has to talk, and he'll give you the information you want.
But you're dealing often with people who are master politicians who presumably also know sometimes the use of silence. And I'm curious with someone like Moses, where you say, he was a monologuist and he talked and he talked. Did he ever use silence against
No, you didn't have to with Moses. With Moses, if you asked a question, he might answer it for an hour and a half. The thing about it was you didn't want to interrupt. When I started an interview, as I was a young reporter, I had won a couple of really minor journalistic awards. But when you're young and you win anything, you think you know everything. I thought I really knew how political power worked. From the minute Robert Moses started talking to me, I knew that I knew nothing compared to him. I mean, it was like I had never even dreamed of this level of political genius.
You mentioned being part of the history book club, and that's funny because my next question leading out from Caro is going to be about how much I know you love history, and so guests like Isabel Wilkerson and Caro are among your favorites. Are there other subjects? You've interviewed people about such an incredible diversity of things. Are there other subjects you gravitate toward or you feel especially kind of enlivened by when you're talking to someone about on the podcast?
I always like to talk about biography and related to that memoir, but I just, for me, self-help books has always been biography and memoir. Like, let's see how this person did it. When I was a kid, I would read biographies of, Clara Barton and Helen Keller and Dolly Madison. I mean, that was what was available to me at the time. The choices were a little limited, but I would read them and draw my own life lessons from them. Like, wow, if Helen Keller has this attitude, like, what's my problem? So interviewing people about their own lives or their deep dives into other people's lives, that's always a huge draw.
Sam always said that fiction was particularly hard to talk about on the podcast. Have you found that to be the case? And if you did it first, have you found a way around it or a way into it that feels better?
Fiction is hard. I think it's difficult because the truth is some fiction writers, not all, but some fiction writers don't really love talking about their work. They feel they have put it on the page and there it is. It has been written. And others, of course, can talk at great length with insight about their work, but you don't necessarily know which one you're going to get.
Now, with someone like James McBride, who is the subject of one of your other favorite episodes, I guess it doesn't really matter what he writes because he's just such a great presence in interview. It must be fun to talk to someone who just has that kind of energy.
Oh, I love talking to James McBride. I mean, I've had him on twice, and I will have him on whenever he writes his next book. You've profiled James McBride, right?
Yeah, I spent a really nice day with him once.
So you know what I'm talking about. He's just endlessly curious and interesting and multifaceted and just a very nice guy.
Yeah, and very open.
Yes.
You get the sense that he's not pulling any punches.
My mom did some volunteer work at a place where he was also involved in some charitable work. And I think that was sort of our initial connection. But he's the kind of person that, like, no matter how remote and small, like the whatever connection you have, I feel like, he's just kind of open armed.
Yes, totally. Let's take a listen to a clip from an interview with McBride where, interestingly enough, the two of you are talking about Robert Caro.
Robert Caro, the great Robert Caro, is probably the most important writer. He's got to be one of the top 5 most important writers in New York history. Really, Robert Caro is just a bad dude. Yeah. He is just a bad dude.
So you reread The Power Broker.
I reread The Power Broker. I read it when I was at Columbia. When I went to graduate school, Columbia, they made us read it over the summer. It's even better the second time around. But it really showed how Robert Moses really destroyed a lot of Brooklyn and a lot of the Bronx, and anywhere he touched.
With the road construction and
he
the
just
parks
dropped highways.
Yeah.
I mean, God bless the people in Brooklyn Heights who fought him off. Because Brooklyn Heights remains now one of the most beautiful sections of Brooklyn. They fought him tooth and nail, and they won. But in Red Hook, for example, that BQE, it just goes right through the heart of a lot of Red Hook. It just slices, his highway sliced New York to bits. So it was fascinating to read about how New York evolved and changed during Moses' time, which was, some of that was during the 60s.
You chose in this novel to refer to the area where most of the book takes place. You refer to it as South Brooklyn, as opposed to Red Hook. I mean, is that a way to distance it slightly?
Yeah, because see, the cause houses that takes place, that's the name of the housing project. Red Hook inspired this place, but physically in my mind it was different than the actual Red Hook. There was a lot more accessibility between communities.
Going to a much darker subject. I've always been very curious about the episode.
Thank you for bringing me home, John.
Yes, exactly. Let's get grim. I've always been really curious about the episode with Sue Klebold because it's a very good episode. And also it really stands out to me. She's, of course, the mother of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the shooters at the Columbine massacre in 1999. And she wrote a memoir about 15 years after the event. And you spoke to her on the podcast, which I thought was brave, and also it did turn out very well. But I'm curious about how you felt going into that and what some of your approaches were to addressing such a sensitive subject to someone so close to it.
I want to turn the tables now and ask you, why did you think it was brave? Just because you have to ask her uncomfortable questions?
Yeah, and because I guess it's very rare, in the archives, we have so many hundreds of episodes and guests, and I really can't think of another one where we've had people who write memoirs about personal things that are difficult, struggles with illness, but even having someone, let's say, die who you know or love of a disease or something is just so much different. This is such a radical life story, and I'm sure that her life has been so strange since then, and so you have to approach both the tragedy and this grieving mother.
Yeah. One thing you can't help but wonder is, I'm sure there are people who look at her as some kind of villain or suspect in some way. How could you raise this child? The premise of the Lionel Shriver novel, We Need to Talk About Kevin, like something must be wrong with you. And I think maybe reading Andrew Solomon's excellent book, Far from the Tree, was probably helpful in thinking about that in a more compassionate or nuanced way. That book is about children whose identities are less about where they're from and their parents and more about other people who share a condition or a way of identifying. So, for example, he writes about deaf children of hearing parents. He writes about child prodigies. And at one point, he writes about parents of children who become murderers, is one of the chapters. And so I do believe that he interviewed Sue Klebold for that chapter. It's probably, again, I don't read a lot of parenting books. It's probably the best parenting book because it really forces you to think about your children as individuals. And so I think I also, with that Sue Klebold episode, thought about approaching her as a parent.
Well, to flatter you to your face, I thought it was I thought you did a remarkable job of approaching it with rigor, but also with compassion. And I thought it was it's one of my favorite episodes too. So let's take a listen to a clip from that interview.
When you think about the story of this book and that progression, there are sort of three natural parts. There's Dylan's childhood, your own story as a mother raising him. There's, of course, the day of the killings, and then there is the aftermath. Was there a part that was the most difficult for you to write?
I don't think there was a part that was most difficult. Anytime I write about Dylan and write about losing him, even now when I talk about it, 17 years later, I still cry, I still weep. But I don't avoid weeping. It's not something that I avoid because it makes me feel sad. It's something that I embrace. I embrace the opportunity to feel that grief because it helps me keep Dylan alive in my heart.
Did you find it hard to explain the complexity of emotions that you feel as a mother, someone who loves your son at the same time that you have the feelings that one would about what he did on that day, your feelings towards the victims. Was explaining that difficult, or did that come easily?
It came somewhat easily after I understood what those feelings really were. In the beginning, after the tragedy, I was so confused and bewildered and feeling so many feelings at the same time, because you do feel humiliation and you feel shame and you feel sorrow and you feel fear. The real work came with identifying those feelings so that I could write about them and explain them.
Okay, Pamela, this has been fun. I'm going to end with a question that we didn't prep any of this, but especially not this. So you might be caught off guard. No, I want to ask, I'm going to borrow a page from our By the Book feature in the book review. And I'm going to say that if there was one person, living or dead, who you could have a full hour with on the podcast to talk to, in or out of the book world, who would it be and why?
Can they be dead?
They can totally be dead.
All right.
I mean, we'll have to revive them for the podcast.
Okay.
But they can be dead.
I think it would be George Eliot.
Interesting.
Yeah. She was so ahead of her time in her fiction. And I haven't read Romola, but I've read basically everything else. And I've read most of her letters, and which are not as good as you want them to be. And probably, unlike most people, Middlemarch is not my favorite. I love it, but I really love Daniel Deronda. She was one of those people who was endlessly curious and taught herself Hebrew and pushed herself in interesting ways. And I would just like to find out how she did it.
Well, it'll be a real coup for the podcast, so I'll get to work.
That's right. See, John helps me book my guests, so he's consider this a marching order.
Yeah, well, I'll expect a big promotion if I land this one. Pamela, thanks for taking the time, and congratulations on 8 years of terrific hosting.
Oh, well, thank you, John. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.